Good morning, you wonderful mutants. Doing this early in the morning today. I couldn't sleep super well last night, so I'm working on the Armory chapter. Okay, so I got really cocky with this chapter. I thought I was going to finish it up earlier this week, and I actually got a lot of really important elements of it down. And immediately when I started working on the interactions there and comparing them to real-world examples, I started getting into trouble, which is actually a good sign. I found that when I run into trouble, that forces me to innovate in a way that is that halfway point between making a playable game and making something that... Ooh, that's good coffee. Anyway, it's making something that's like an actual reality simulating engine, which, yeah. Anyway, so some of the stats I've dropped down for vehicles, and you should be able to see these in the Armory preview I put out. Some of those, I think, are really good axioms on which to build vehicles, largely because, and I've discovered this by working with it, it makes a vehicle translatable into the rules, rather than making a set of principles that can create any sort of conceivable vehicle, which I don't really think is even a goal I ever should have set myself in the first place. Because, like, the physics of our actual world are still something we are learning about, and the way we can engineer things is still something that we are constantly breaking ground on in our actual real existence on Earth. And so it's kind of inappropriate to say that, like, oh, here's a set of game principles that will allow you to make the equivalent of any kind of vehicle that could possibly conceivably exist within physical reality, plus also magic. That would have to be the game. Like, if the game was only that, it would be as thick as it's going to be otherwise, and there would be nothing in it except for the design rules for that. And I don't really want that. I've come to realize, and this is actually a really satisfying thought, that I'm not really designing something that comprehensive. What I'm designing is the amount of that you need to take into a game that is essentially about throwing punches over and over again with magical superpowers behind them. So that's kind of like lifted the burden of expectation off my shoulders a lot. And that's been one of the single greatest innovations I think that's allowed me to get this far into the design, especially considering how ambitious it was when we started out, and it's still ambitious. Like, you're still talking about having a full suite of an armory, having a full suite of a bestiary, having like these gigantic power scales and everything, and still having something that is playable and fun and scales with the characters and works within setting prep and has a preppable and runnable world that you can write down in the same kind of solid, gameable, approachable way you can write down a dungeon. Like, that's shooting for the stars. It really is. And a game like this doesn't really exist yet. There are chunks of this game, and the chunks that I've been working with, of course, are Legends of the Woolen and Weapons of the Gods, which all have a really kind of crazy power scale and really good, satisfying tactical combat. Couple of warts, but honestly, it's the closest I've ever gotten to something that feels like a really cool martial arts battle in a role-playing game. The Marvel Face Rip system, which has a ridiculous power scale and knows how to categorize it in a way that's satisfying in play. It also has the Karma system, which is a really good way to encourage the kind of behavior you want to see out of a hero. And versions of that XP system have existed in every Marvel role-playing game since, so I've kind of yoinked from all of those too. And the other one, of course, is Dungeons & Dragons. Dungeons & Dragons is great for prepping something solidly and just being able to expect that you can run those things, whether it's a hex full of content or a town or a dungeon, which is a classic example. Like, you really can, with a few little maps and charts and lists, make a whole campaign that's very explorable in this kind of organic way. You can almost like program in a game as complicated and rich and interesting as like Breath of the Wild, which is a very modern game, into just a couple of sheets of paper. And that's really impressive. And taking the chunks of those systems and infusing them together as we have, we've really made something fantastic so far. So I just wanted to take a moment to thank everyone for helping me to do this. I really cannot do it without all you guys. And it's been a fantastic journey so far, and I'm really excited how far we've come and how close we are to finishing it and getting this game in everyone's hands. Anyway, so I keep running into physics problems with this game, with this armory. Um, the armor rules do not work on a linear scale at all. I've been realizing that this morning, because like what makes something well armored is relative to what can reach it. So like, for example, I was studying anti-aircraft stuff from World War II as one of the, because I want this to feel, to do what you would expect these rules should be able to do. And one of the physics problems of destroying an aircraft isn't even penetrating its armor, it's being able to hit it, because you're projecting something upward through the air, which is the biggest payload of kinetic energy that you have to deliver to something, is getting it the hell up there in the first place. And a plane kind of comes at that from an angle, and they're able to gradually gain altitude, and that's way different than having to suddenly launch and maintain high velocity, because the killing power of a bullet, physically speaking, is in how fast it is going, not in how big it is necessarily. So yeah, and battleship things, they can arc with gravity's rainbow. It's cool if they come down, if they still have a lot of mass, because they still have a ton of kinetic energy invested in them. And so like anti-naval weaponry can arc downward and be much bigger and heavier, and actually doesn't require as much energy as you'd expect. The big energy in that is just getting the big shell where it will hit the battleship. But anti-aircraft needs smaller bullets that are propelled at ridiculous energy just to get to aircraft. But as it turns out, if you can overcome the initial problem of shooting them that high up in the first place, it's not that much more to be able to destroy an aircraft, because they're delicate. Like, even the heaviest armored aircraft is really light and delicate compared to anything ground-based, because there's gravity working in its favor. And so, yeah, the armor that is most effective for those is surprisingly thin, and it's really hard to, like, because of the scale at which you operate whenever you're shooting planes and flying planes, there really should be something in the mechanics, in the rule somewhere, that says after a certain distance, bullets lose killing power. And physically, that is actually true. It's actually a very, very short distance. But the reason I abstracted range to being in descriptive bands was because I didn't want to have to measure range. I didn't want to have to map out every square inch of the planet. The abstraction is to save work for the GM and the players. You can add more work in later, but the initial abstraction should be as abstract as possible, and you should core down to details. Like that's the way you should approach that, so that you are choosing to have a heavier cognitive workload whenever you want it, not that you have this impossible to digest amount of information that you then regurgitate to the players. So I've already played for over a year with vertical zones and relative areas, and I don't like it. It doesn't work for me. It's a level of detail that, like, is at once both, it's too much and too little at the same time. Because, like, okay, I don't care for having to, it doesn't really matter if you don't have to prep it, you know? So, like, if you say, like, city height, like the height of the reasonably tall buildings, like the average height of buildings in a city in this post-apocalypse thing is one zone vertically, and you're just stacking those zones vertically, and then you just measure the amount that you can go with a bullet. Like, that's busy work and kind of a weird abstraction, but you could do it. It's just, I just don't want to. And I don't want to have to give that burden to GMs and say, okay, are you considering all the physics of this? It's not a physics simulator. At the same time, you invite that whenever you're saying that this is the tactical reality. You know, you can do what you could do in real life. So I'm in a conundrum with things like anti-aircraft guns, because, like, okay, yes, if you shoot someone at point blank range with an anti-aircraft gun versus shooting an aircraft, like at aircraft altitude with an anti-aircraft gun, those are going to be two very different kinetic experiences on the receiving end. And so the same amount of armor would not work. Like, you can penetrate some tank armor with anti-aircraft guns, even though technically they're only designed to destroy aircraft, which have much lighter armor. That's really, man, how do you, what do you do there? You know, I don't want you to have to recalculate the hitting and killing power of your anti-aircraft gun depending on how far upward or what angle that you approach it with because like different cruising altitudes would mean different amounts of deadliness. It really does. That's an actual consideration in warfare. And so planes were designed to fly higher so that guns would have a harder time getting to them. These are real things people had to think about. And because they were actually thought about, there are actual real answers to them. It's frustrating because I want players to be able to say, why don't we just design this to fly higher, and for that to have the reward you would expect. At the same time, oh God, man, even though it wouldn't probably be very hard to put into the game, okay, after, if you double the effective range of this, then it's half the killing power or whatever. That's not actually how it works physically. It's much more complicated than that. And yeah, I don't know. Lighter armor and able to fly higher is actually a better strategy than heavier armor and able to fly lower. It just is. That's just one thing. That's just one of the things that I've ran into. Like tank armor is another good example. A lot of tank armor now has to account for things like radiation, which you would have to account for in the post-apocalypse, of course, and like the ability of like fire to sap oxygen from the compartments inside of the tank. So if it's not airtight, if it isn't like if the heat outside can actually sap oxygen from the inside, you can actually effectively suffocate the occupants without damaging the outside of the tank, as long as you completely coat it in fire. And so it's actually really inexpensive to make like explosives that are basically just Molotov cocktails that just have gas and fire that will burn for a while on the outside of a tank. And you're talking about millions of dollars sank into each tank. But you could, for like less than $300 worth of Molotov cocktails, destroy everyone inside of a tank by suffocating them. Like, how do you account for that in a linear armor scale? It's armor 7K. What does that mean? So I think the linear scale is largely inappropriate, but I'm committed to it because it's simple. So there's a lot of things like that where, and this actually happened in the last chapter too, as you'll recall, where I was like, okay, there's a lot of detail that I need to abstract in a satisfying way. It's going to be the same thing here. I'm going to find some appeal to gameability. Gameability is ultimately the arbiter of how I design rules. It's not going to be realistic. It's going to be gameable. That's the thing that wins. So I'm going to have to find an abstraction that allows a GM to make an argument. And a lot of rules design for me has been that. As soon as I accepted the tactical infinity, that saved me a lot of work. It also created a lot of work because you have to be able to hand your GM an appeal and say, okay, you might have one of those Poindexter players who's like, well, with fifth, blah, blah. Okay, yeah, we get it, Poindexter. You're smart. You're not smart enough to not ruin everyone's good time, though. Still, I feel like that guy does need to get satisfied, at least to some degree. Because there's going to be GMs that are like that, too. I'm a GM that's like that. I demanded more out of games, and that's why I designed this one. So as much as I want to mock that guy, like, that guy is right. So, yeah, a lot of my game design career has been just trying to answer that guy, like thinking of the worst version of that guy that I can be, which is got to be in the running for the worst version of that guy that exists, and being like, okay, what answer would satisfy me? And I found a pretty good one for domains when it came to like trading things among, because that was the big thing, was like, okay, Earth as a category is a weird kind of thing for goods to show up in. And like not all things that could be categorized as Earth would necessarily be interchangeable, but you can abstract that. You can say like, okay, but you could either A, through some kind of weird magic sympathy that exists in their universe and doesn't in ours, or B, just by simply trading something, or realizing there are byproducts and things like that that aren't necessarily apparent whenever you're tallying these things at the level we're abstracting them to. You can make something that allows you to kind of fudge over that issue. And it's going to be kind of the same here. I'm probably just going to have a little call out box. That's probably what I'm going to do. I'm trying to talk myself through this design problem. That's just like, okay, yeah, we know armor doesn't work exactly this way, but bear with us because we're throwing atomic fireballs around from human beings. And so, like, and I'm going to have to make sure it's clear that there's no compatibility between armor that a vehicle has and armor that a person has. People armor works under different principles. Just because so does people fighting in this world, you know. Okay. I think we're under 20 minutes, so we're going to call that good. Anyway, Armory chapter, where are we with it? We're doing pretty good. I'm getting a translator that effectively allows me to take a real-world example of the statistics of a vehicle, translate them into lone wolf fist mechanics, and that's about all that I want from that. It's enough of a tool I can give it to GMs with a good, healthy list of robust options and say, okay, now you can play if you don't care to do this part. And also, if you do care to do this part, there's a good translator here, and you can use that to do your own things. In terms of designing new vehicles via players, like if a player is like, I want to take my rocket bike and put a tank cannon on it, I think I don't really have a good notion for how to do that. Like, because the craft rules are about making things that exist in the real world or making magic things, right? And they both kind of operate on the same principles. But like redesigning something and asking the very loose physics simulator of this rules, hey, could this work? And then thinking of a game cost for that in terms of time and resources to make that balanced in a way where it's not necessarily the best of all options. That's kind of a tall order. That's asking a lot out of a system. And I don't know. I don't know if I can make something that would be a satisfying version of that in general, because it doesn't really interest me that much. And B, I don't know if this game needs that. I think what I'm going to do with that one is I'm going to say that vehicles kind of operate on a tier based on their like size maybe, and weapons of that tier are compatible with them. And I might say that you can engineer it one tier out. Like I can just assume that there's enough wiggle room in the weird physics of this fallen world that kind of makes sense. Same thing with armor. It's not necessarily interchangeable, but there is some wiggle room. And I think I'll just make that normal craft projects. Like retrofitting could be kind of equivalent to repairing. And yeah, I think that works. That's okay. I should probably write that down. But yeah, I think that works. Okay, so I've got to work on a horsepower and fuel consumption chart real quick. I'm going to try to do it on a 1 to 10 scale. Wish me luck. Same thing with armor. Kind of going to try to do it like a 1 to 10 scale or like a 1 to 20 scale. Wish me luck. Then, yeah, I'll do some examples, and we're going to call that part of the armory good. Now, I've still got 2 minutes here. There is a magic items part of this. And I think I'm going to try to keep it kind of simple. I'm going to do categories of magic items, and it's going to be very similar to the categories of Kung Fu techniques. So you have like novice and form and expert and master and all that. And I'm just going to kind of tier them about the same. So they're in the same different capability range. And then I'm just going to put a cost on that is equivalent or close to equivalent to the cost of learning a technique, or the amount of techniques that is. And I'm going to make that a craft-based thing. I might not. I don't know. I don't know if I want to go Exalted Third Ed where you have to go on epic quests to get magic artifacts. I don't know. What I might do is make it so that to get something really magical, there has to be a miraculous circumstance. So like Emperor Zhao dies, and so only now in this fallen era can the Tiger Soul be forged, and only by the blackest heart of the age or something like that. You know, like make it so that you as a GM are completely in control of when a magic item can exist, or something along those lines, where it's not just I'm going to make a factory that spits out Tiger Souls. Like, no, it doesn't. You're missing the point of Tiger Soul if you do that. It's not about having a powerful sword. It's about the sword being like the nuclear weapon in the tactical landscape. You know, that's what Tiger Soul's about. Anyway, that's all for now. Goodbye.